I'm Evelyn Hart, 62 years old, living in Boston, Massachusetts, and I spent nearly 3 decades as a high school English teacher. I devoted my entire life to raising my only daughter, Rachel. After my husband passed away, I thought love and sacrifice would keep us close. But just a few weeks ago, at her wedding menu tasting, Rachel looked me straight in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome on her big day. Surrounded by the polished laughter of her future in-laws and the delicate clinking of champagne glasses, it felt like someone had ripped my heart out in front of the entire room. But that wasn't even the worst part, because I knew a secret Rachel had been hiding from everyone, a secret powerful enough to destroy the wedding and the future she was so carefully building. What shocked me most was realizing that, to protect this truth, my daughter was willing to trample over our bond and push me out of her life like I was nothing more than a burden. I'd kept my mouth shut for years, but not this time. You won't believe what I did right after I walked out of that dinner. Stay with me, because when this story hits its peak, you'll understand why sometimes the moment you're pushed aside is the exact moment you take back everything. And before we go on, tell me, where are you listening to this from? That night, after leaving the restaurant, I didn't drive straight home. I just kept going, letting the Boston streets blur past me in streaks of yellow and red. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but it was the tension in my chest that hurt most. Rachel's voice replayed in my head, sharp and dismissive. "You're not welcome." I'd heard cruel words before, students lashing out in class, parents blaming me for their children's failures, but nothing had ever cut as deep as my own daughter casting me out of her life on the eve of her wedding. I pulled into a quiet parking lot by the harbor and sat there, watching the ripples of moonlight dance across the water. I told myself to breathe, but my thoughts were spiraling. Rachel had always been ambitious, but over the last few years, her hunger for status had turned into something darker. She wanted the right connections, the right last name, the right life, and Thomas Whitmore, her fiancé, was the perfect ticket. His family's old money and spotless reputation were everything she'd dreamed of. But I knew something Thomas didn't. 3 weeks earlier, I'd stopped by Rachel's apartment unannounced. She'd asked for my mother's pearl necklace, an heirloom I'd guarded for decades, and I thought I'd surprise her by delivering it in person. The door was unlocked. I called her name, expecting her to come from the kitchen or bedroom. Instead, I walked straight into a scene that made my stomach drop. She was wrapped around Dylan Cross, her college boyfriend, kissing him like she hadn't seen him in years. Dylan wasn't just a blast from her past. He was the very man she'd told me had destroyed her heart. And yet here they were, tangled together, oblivious to my presence. I froze, my mind racing between shock and disbelief. She didn't see me. Neither of them did. My instinct told me to scream, to throw the necklace at her feet and demand an explanation. But instead, I backed away silently, closing the door with shaking hands. I didn't want to make a scene without knowing the full truth. And in the days that followed, I realized that truth was uglier than I could have imagined. Rachel didn't just cheat, she was planning something. I could see it in the way she avoided talking about the wedding details with me, the way she brushed off my questions about Thomas's family, the way her social media presence suddenly exploded with photos of expensive dinners, weekend trips, and designer clothes. And Dylan, he was always in the background, a shadow that lingered too close for comfort. I tried to give her the chance to come clean. I called, I sent messages, I even invited her to lunch, but each time she refused, claiming she was too busy. And then came the rehearsal dinner. The moment she decided to humiliate me in front of the Whitmores, that was the breaking point. Sitting in my car by the harbor, I thought about Thomas. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he seemed like a genuinely kind man. At 42, he'd been through a rough breakup a couple of years earlier, something Rachel had always described as tragic. She said his ex-fiancée had cheated on him, and Rachel had been there to help him heal. Now I was starting to wonder if she'd been the one to cause his pain in the first place. I couldn't sit there any longer. I started the engine. and drove home to my small apartment in Beacon Hill. The place felt different that night, smaller somehow, lonelier. I poured myself a glass of Merlot and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the pearl necklace still sitting in its velvet case. That necklace had survived generations of heart women, and now it was tangled in a mess of lies. I opened my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Laura Bennett's name. She was Thomas's ex, though we'd never met in person. I only knew her from what Rachel had told me, which, in hindsight, could have been nothing but fabrication. My thumb hovered over the call button, my heart pounding. If what I suspected was true, Laura had been wronged just like Thomas was about to be, maybe even by the same people. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pressed call. The line rang 3 times before a tired, cautious voice answered. "Hello. Laura Bennett," I asked. "Yes, who is this?" I hesitated for just a moment. "My name is Evelyn Hart. You were once engaged to Thomas Whitmore." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for me to think she might hang up. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I think we need to talk about Thomas, about his wedding tomorrow, and about my daughter." Silence again, then a slow exhale. "Where?" We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop downtown, neutral ground where she could walk away if she wanted. I arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a corner table where I could see the door when Laura walked in. I recognized her immediately from old photos, a petite blonde with sharp blue eyes and a guarded expression. She sat across from me, folding her hands on the table. "This is probably the strangest call I've ever gotten," she said. "You said something about Rachel." I leaned in. "Before Thomas proposed to Rachel, did anything strange happen between you and her?" Her lips tightened. "Strange isn't the word. She destroyed me." The next half hour was a flood of revelations, fabricated evidence, fake credit card charges, text messages she swore she never sent. It was a deliberate, calculated setup that had convinced Thomas she'd been unfaithful. And suddenly, every puzzle piece snapped into place. Rachel hadn't just stumbled into Thomas's life. After his heartbreak, she'd orchestrated it. And Dylan, he'd been there all along, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the payout. When Laura finished, we sat in silence, the weight of what she'd told me pressing down like a lead blanket. I could feel the first spark of something I hadn't felt in years, a sharp, focused sense of purpose. "Will you help me stop this wedding?" I asked. Her eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. "Tell me what you have in mind." We sat there for a long moment, the hum of the espresso machine and the faint chatter of students in the background. Laura's expression was calm, but her fingers tapped lightly on the table. Small, restless movements that told me she was holding back a storm. I slid my phone across to her, pulling up the one piece of evidence I had: the photo I'd taken 3 weeks earlier of Rachel in her apartment with Dylan. His hand was in her hair, her face tilted toward him, the timestamp glowing like an unshakable witness. Laura stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. "That's him," she said flatly. "Dylan Cross. She used to talk about him all the time when we were friends. Told Thomas he'd cheated on her in college, that he'd broken her heart. I guess she left out the part where she never actually broke up with him." My chest felt heavy. She told me the same story. Laura shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "You know what the worst part is? Thomas believes everything she says without question. She plays the victim so well he doesn't even see her coming." I leaned forward. "That's why we have to make him see. Not just Thomas, everyone. His family, the guests. The whole room needs to know exactly who they're celebrating before it's too late." She looked at me for a long time, assessing. "We'll need more than a picture and my word. If we go at her without solid proof, she'll twist it. She's had 2 years to perfect her lies." I knew she was right. Rachel had always been good at turning situations to her advantage. As a child, she could break a vase and somehow convince me the cat had done it. As an adult, She'd just gotten better at hiding the cracks. Laura's eyes narrowed. We need records, financial, digital, anything that connects her to Dylan beyond your photo. And if what I think happened to me really did happen, there'll be a trail. That's when I thought of Gerald, my nephew, my late sister's son. He worked in IT security and had always distrusted Rachel's sudden lifestyle change. He'd even once asked me point blank if she was running some kind of scheme, and I'd brushed it off as cynicism. Maybe I should have listened. I told Laura about him, and for the first time that evening, her guarded expression softened just a fraction. If he's willing to help, we might have a shot. I glanced at the clock. It was after midnight. He'll help, I said, pulling out my phone, and we don't have much time. Gerald answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. Aunt Evelyn. It's the middle of the night. What's wrong? It's Rachel. I said simply, I need you to come over. Bring your laptop. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost all traces of sleep. What happened? I'll explain when you get here. He arrived 40 minutes later, hair tousled, wearing an old Northwestern sweatshirt. Laura and I were still at my kitchen table, our coffee gone cold, the weight of the plan beginning to take shape. Gerald dropped his laptop bag onto the table and took the seat across from us. Talk, he said. I told him everything: Rachel's affair, Laura's story, my suspicion that Rachel had framed her to get to Thomas. Gerald didn't interrupt, but his eyes sharpened with every detail. By the time I finished, his fingers were already poised over the keyboard. If she framed Laura, there'll be a pattern, he said. No one's that careful for that long. Laura leaned forward. 2 years ago, there were charges on my credit card. I never made hotel rooms. Expensive dinners. I was working night shifts at the hospital when those charges happened. I can give you the exact dates. That's a start, Gerald said, typing quickly. If I can match those transactions to IP addresses or accounts tied to Rachel, we'll have something. And if Dylan's been around, his name might show up too. We watched in silence as his screen filled with lines of code, spreadsheets, and account histories. I didn't understand half of what he was doing, but the focus on his face was all I needed to see. Gerald had inherited his father's methodical patience, and right now, that patience was our best weapon. After nearly an hour, he stopped. Got it. Look at this. On the screen were Laura's credit card statements from 2 years ago. Every suspicious charge lined up perfectly with the nights she'd been on shift. They were all online transactions, Gerald said, meaning whoever did this didn't need the physical card, just the number. Laura's mouth tightened. Rachel stayed over at my place a few times back then. She could have had access to my wallet, my phone, everything. Gerald nodded. And that's not all. I pulled Dylan Cross's bank records. He gave us a wry smile. Don't ask how. Yeah. Scrolling down, he highlighted a column of deposits, $3,000 in each, every month. For the past 2 years. Different sources each time, but they match up almost exactly to cash advances from Rachel's credit card, the one Thomas pays for. The room went still. She's been paying him, I whispered. Paying him with Thomas's money, Gerald corrected. And it gets better. She keeps detailed financial records, spreadsheets, tracking every payment, every expense. It's like she's documenting her own fraud. Laura's eyes widened. If we can show that to Thomas's family. Gerald held up a hand. It's not just Thomas. This pattern, I've found 3 other names connected to Dylan. All wealthy, all targeted in similar ways. This isn't just a love affair. It's a business. Rachel's just one of his partners. The air in the kitchen felt heavier now, charged with something that was part fear, part adrenaline. Laura looked at me. If we're going to do this, we needed to do it fast. The wedding's in less than 20 hours. I nodded slowly. Then we don't waste another minute. Gerald's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. I think I know exactly how to make this public. Gerald's eyes gleamed with the kind of focus I'd only seen in him once before, back when he was dismantling a phishing scam that had nearly cost his friend's parents their retirement. He spun the laptop toward us, pulling up a blank presentation file. "We're going to package this so that no one can ignore it," he said. "If Rachel has built her image on smoke and mirrors, then all we have to do is blow the smoke away in front of the right audience." Laura folded her arms, "And the right audience is 300 of Boston's most influential people at the Whitmore wedding." "Exactly," Gerald said. "We don't need the police right now. They can't use half of this evidence because of how I got it. But if we drop it in the middle of the reception, in front of everyone whose opinion matters to Thomas's family, Rachel can't spin her way out. Her entire network will collapse before she even leaves the ballroom." I hesitated. "That means destroying my daughter publicly." Laura leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "She destroyed herself. We're just making sure everyone sees it happen." Gerald began pulling files into the presentation: credit card statements, bank transfers, screenshots of Rachel and Dylan's messages. He worked quickly, organizing them so that each piece built on the last. First came the photo of Rachel and Dylan together in her apartment, then the payment records, then the connections to the other victims, and finally, the text exchanges where they referred to Thomas as the mark and discussed the exact timeline for their exit strategy. It was damning. Even I, who had seen pieces of it already, felt my stomach twist as the full scope came into view. Laura pointed to one of the slides. "We should open with that. The timestamp makes it impossible to dispute." Gerald nodded. "And we'll end with the bigger picture: the fact that Dylan's been running this scheme with multiple women. That way, the Whitmores see that Rachel isn't just unfaithful, she's part of an organized fraud ring." I rubbed my temples, the weight of what we were doing pressing down hard. How do we even get this on the screens at the reception? Laura's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's the easy part. I called the Fairmont Grand earlier this week under the pretense of being a surprise guest with a tribute video for the couple. The AV team is expecting me tomorrow. They'll plug in whatever we hand them." Gerald grinned. "You're colder than I thought." "I'm practical," Laura replied, "and I don't like losing." We worked through the night, fine-tuning the slides, stripping away anything that could be dismissed as speculation. Every document was clear. Every transaction matched with dates, times, and accounts. Gerald even created a visual flowchart showing how Rachel siphoned Thomas's money to Dylan, who then laundered it through multiple small accounts before pulling it back in cash. By the time dawn crept through my kitchen windows, the presentation was airtight. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, while Gerald emailed an encrypted copy to himself and to Laura, just in case. "You'll be in the ballroom already, right?" he asked her. She nodded. "Far corner, near the AV booth. As soon as they dim the lights for the speeches, I'll give the signal." I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, and me. Gerald closed the laptop. "You just have to be there. Front row. Let her see your face when it hits." The image of Rachel's expression in that moment flashed in my mind, and I wasn't sure if it filled me with satisfaction or dread. We split up to get some rest, what little we could manage. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the one who'd once told me I was her hero. How did she become someone capable of orchestrating something this cold? Had I missed the signs, or had they been there all along, hidden behind a smile and a carefully curated version of herself? By late morning, I forced myself to get up. I chose a navy dress, simple, understated, and my mother's pearl earrings. They felt like armor, a quiet reminder of the women in my family who had endured their own betrayals and kept going. When I arrived at the Fairmont Grand just after 1 o'clock, the lobby was already buzzing. Guests milled about in designer suits and gowns, sipping champagne beneath crystal chandeliers. I caught glimpses of Boston's elite judges, CEOs, politicians, exactly the kind of people Rachel had spent her adult life trying to impress. Scarlett Whitmore, Thomas's mother, spotted me almost immediately. Her smile was tight, polite. "Evelyn, I didn't expect to see you." "Wouldn't miss Rachel's big day," I said evenly. Her eyes flicked over my outfit, her tone dripping with condescension. "Well, I suppose it's nice you could make the effort." I offered her my own polite smile. "It's going to be a day to remember." Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was pure elegance, white roses spilling from tall crystal vases, soft music from a string quartet, the scent of expensive perfume and catered delicacies. I found my assigned seat, third row, aisle. Close enough to see everything, but deliberately separated from the Whitmore family section. Thomas appeared a few minutes later, making his way through the guests with easy charm. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Evelyn, I'm so glad you're here," he said warmly. "Rachel wasn't sure you'd make it." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," I replied, the words tasting strange even as I said them. He smiled, clearly touched. "You've raised an incredible woman." I forced a nod, my throat tightening. She's exactly who she's always been. Thomas moved on to greet other guests, and Laura slipped into the seat beside me. "Gerald's in position," she whispered. "Once the maid of honor finishes her speech, it's showtime." I glanced toward the back of the room and spotted him near the AV booth, a flash drive in his hand. My heart pounded in my ears. The ceremony passed in a blur, vows recited with theatrical sincerity, rings exchanged, the kiss that drew polite applause. Then came the reception. Wine poured, silverware clinked against plates, and speeches began. As the maid of honor wrapped up, Laura caught Gerald's eye and gave the slightest nod. The lights dimmed. And just like that, the first image appeared on the massive screens, Rachel in Dylan's arms. Timestamp and all. For a heartbeat, the entire ballroom seemed frozen. Forks hovered midair, champagne flutes stilled. The string quartet faltered into silence as 300 sets of eyes turned toward the giant screens. The photo was impossible to misinterpret. Rachel in Dylan's arms, her lips inches from his. The timestamp burned into the corner. At the head table, Thomas's smile faded, confusion knitting his brow. He glanced toward Rachel, clearly expecting some sort of explanation. She, however, sat rigid, her face draining of color before flushing an angry red. A low murmur began to ripple through the crowd. Phones appeared in guests' hands, some snapping photos, others whispering to their neighbors. The next slide appeared a screenshot of text messages between Rachel and Dylan. The font was huge, the words crystal clear from anywhere in the room. "He's so trusting it's almost pathetic, like taking candy from a baby. 2 more years, max, then we cash out and disappear." Gasps filled the air. Thomas stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. The camera flashes from the photographers, meant to capture a celebration, now lit up his confusion and dawning horror. Rachel shot to her feet, voice trembling with forced indignation. "This is fake. Someone's trying to sabotage me." But the next slide left no room for her denials. Bank statements from Thomas's own accounts, showing repeated cash advances, each matched to deposits into Dylan's accounts. The lines connecting them in Gerald's chart glowed bright red, like arteries of betrayal. "This isn't real," Rachel shouted again, louder this time. Her voice cracked, drawing more stares. "Thomas, you know me." "Do I?" he interrupted, his voice sharp enough to slice through the noise. The ballroom was dead silent now, every guest caught between horror and fascination. Laura's voice, steady and cold, carried from our table. "It gets better." And it did. The slides kept coming, proof of Laura's framing 2 years earlier, complete with timestamp charges made while she was in surgery at the hospital. Then came the connection to the other victims, each name and story flashing up for all to see. Rachel's eyes darted wildly, searching for someone, anyone, who might still believe her, but the Whitmores were already recoiling. Scarlett's face pale with outrage. Thomas's father leaned toward his wife, muttering something that made her stiffen even further. By the time the final slide appeared, a summary of the fraud network, Dylan at the center, Rachel one of several women feeding him stolen wealth, the mood in the ballroom had shifted entirely. This wasn't just scandal, it was criminal. Thomas stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Rachel," he said slowly, "how long have you been lying to me?" "I haven't." "Don't." His voice was cold now, stripped of all warmth. "Not here. Not ever again." Before Rachel could reply, movement near the doors drew everyone's attention. Two women in dark suits stepped forward, badges held high. Rachel Hart, the taller one, called out, "Agent Kristen Miller, FBI Financial Crimes Division. You're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Rachel's jaw dropped, her hands instinctively lifting in protest. "This is insane, Thomas. Tell them." But Thomas didn't move. He didn't even look at her. The agent stepped in, cuffing her wrists with practiced efficiency. As they began to lead her out, Rachel's eyes found mine. For the first time in years, I saw something in them that wasn't defiance, it was recognition. She finally understood who she'd been up against. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "Mom, please." I stood slowly, smoothing my dress. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I approached her. I stopped just close enough for only she could hear. "I'm not your mother anymore," I whispered. "I'm the woman who raised a stranger." And then I stepped aside, letting the agents guide her past me toward the exit. As the doors closed behind them, the spell over the room seemed to break. People began talking again, voices low but urgent. The Whitmores huddled together at the head table, their carefully crafted social image crumbling in real time. Thomas remained standing, one hand braced on the table, as if steadying himself. When his eyes met mine across the room, there was no gratitude there, only the haunted look of a man who had just watched his future implode. But underneath it, I thought I saw something else: understanding. Laura joined me, her posture calm, but her grip on her clutch white-knuckled. "It's done," she said quietly. "It started," I corrected. "The police will need statements. Gerald has to hand over the files. And Dylan. They'll get him," she said. "They always do when the evidence is this clean." Gerald approached from the back of the room, his expression a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. Hotel security's locking down the exits. FBI's coordinating with local PD to pick up Dylan before he bolts. I nodded. Then we wait. We didn't wait long. 15 minutes later, an agent returned to the ballroom and quietly informed us Dylan had been taken into custody at a bar less than a mile away. He hadn't even tried to run. I glanced toward the head table. Thomas was sitting now, his tie loosened, his gaze fixed on the empty chair beside him. Scarlett was speaking to someone on her phone, her words clipped and icy. Part of me wanted to go to him, to say something that might soften the blow, but another part knew there was nothing to say. His life had just been gutted. The truth was all I had to give him, and I'd already delivered it. As I turned to leave the ballroom, I felt Laura's hand on my arm. "You okay?" she asked. I considered the question. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I will be." We stepped out into the crisp Boston afternoon together, the muffled sounds of the shattered wedding fading behind us. For the first time in years, I felt the weight on my shoulders start to shift, not disappear, but move. The fight wasn't over, but the worst part was behind us. The next 48 hours were a blur of interviews, paperwork, and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones. The FBI had set up a temporary office in a downtown building, and I found myself sitting across from agents more times than I could count, recounting every detail, from the moment I'd walked into Rachel's apartment 3 weeks earlier. Laura was there too, her calm demeanor masking the undercurrent of tension that flickered in her eyes. Gerald stayed close, handing over files, decrypting messages, and walking the agents through the web of transactions that connected Rachel and Dylan to the other victims. It was clinical work, stripped of the emotional weight it carried for us, but necessary. By the third day, Dylan had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. His statements confirmed what we already knew. Rachel hadn't just been his accomplice, she'd been his most valuable partner. She had a knack for finding men like Thomas successful, lonely, and eager to believe in love again. Dylan played the background role, pulling strings and handling the money while she perfected her performance. Hearing it laid out so plainly made my stomach churn. I had raised a con artist, not just a selfish person, but someone who built an entire life on calculated betrayal. When the agents finally let us go for the day, I walked with Laura along the Boston Harbor. The air was sharp, the wind carrying the salty tang of the Atlantic. We didn't speak for a while, just listened to the water lapping against the docks. "Do you ever wonder," Laura said at last, "if there's a moment where people like Rachel could have turned out differently, or if this was always who they were?" I thought about it. When she was little, she was sweet, thoughtful, or maybe she just knew how to seem that way because it got her what she wanted. I don't know anymore. Laura nodded slowly. "I used to think Thomas would never see through her, but now," she trailed off, glancing out at the dark water, "now I think maybe he's stronger than I gave him credit for." That night, as I couldn't sleep, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone. There were no messages from Rachel. She wasn't allowed to contact me, but the silence still felt heavy. I wasn't mourning her absence. I was mourning the years I'd spent believing in someone who didn't exist. The following week, the prosecutors called me in. Rachel had decided to plead guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft in exchange for a reduced sentence, 7 to 10 years. When I heard the number, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, just a finality, like the closing of a door I'd been standing in for too long. Dylan wasn't as lucky. His charges were more extensive, his criminal history longer. The prosecutors were pushing for 15 years, maybe more. Gerald, ever the pragmatist, came to me with an idea. "We've got a skill set now," he said over coffee one afternoon. "You, me, Laura, we know how these people operate. We could do something with that." Like what I asked. Like start a consulting firm, help people who've been scammed track the money, find the proof. The FBI's overloaded. Private investigators don't always have the tech knowledge. We could fill that gap. Laura was immediately on board. It's not just about catching the criminals. It's about giving victims their footing back. "I know what it's like to feel crazy because someone's rewritten your reality. If we can stop that from happening to someone else." She let the thought trail off. But I understood. Within a month, Hart and Bennett Security Consulting was born. We rented a small office overlooking the harbor. Nothing flashy, but it felt solid, real. The first few clients came through referrals from the FBI cases they couldn't take, but didn't want to leave cold. We worked late nights, followed paper trails across state lines, and sometimes sat in living rooms with people whose lives had been ripped apart, just listening. It was grueling, but it was honest work. Work that gave me something Rachel never had: purpose without strings. One afternoon, about 6 months after the wedding, I looked up from a file to see Thomas standing in our doorway. He looked different, thinner, but steadier, like a man who'd been rebuilding himself piece by piece. "I wanted to thank you," he said, stepping inside. "You already did," I replied. "Not properly." He glanced at Laura. "Both of you. Without you, I'd still be married to her, still bleeding money into Dylan's pocket." Laura shrugged. "We just made sure the truth came out." He hesitated. then said, "I'm starting a foundation for fraud victims. Thought maybe you'd be interested in partnering." It was a generous offer, one that a year ago I might have jumped at, but I'd learned something since all this began. My worth didn't come from being attached to someone else's project. "That's kind," I said, "but we've got our own work to do." Thomas smiled faintly. "Then I'll be your first donor." After he left, Laura raised an eyebrow. "You're really turning down a Whitmore." "I'm really choosing myself," I said simply. That evening, I walked home through the back bay, the street lamps casting long shadows on the brick sidewalks. My brownstone wasn't grand, but it was mine, bought with my own money, earned through my own work. I paused at the front steps, breathing in the crisp night air. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The chaos was behind me. The choices ahead were mine alone. And Rachel, she was just another closed case file. 3 months after Rachel's sentencing, the rhythm of my life had changed completely. The phone in our small office rang regularly, now victims of romance scams, elderly people whose savings had been siphoned away, small business owners blindsided by trusted employees. Each story carried its own kind of heartbreak, but they all shared the same undercurrent: someone had taken advantage of trust. Laura handled intake calls with the calm precision of a nurse triaging patients, while Gerald buried himself in code and spreadsheets, tracing every financial breadcrumb. My role was somewhere in between, listening, piecing together timelines, and asking the kinds of questions that made clients pause, rethink, and remember the detail that would crack their case open. One rainy Thursday, we got a call from a woman named Margaret Collins. Her voice was tight with fear as she explained that her son had been helping manage her retirement accounts and that she'd just discovered nearly half her savings was gone. She wasn't sure if it was theft or just a misunderstanding, but I knew that hesitation victims often didn't want to believe someone they loved could hurt them. We arranged to meet at her home in Cambridge. It was a modest colonial-style house, the kind where every surface held decades of family photos. She poured us coffee at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm probably overreacting," Margaret said, glancing at the living room, where a photo of her son in a graduation cap sat on the mantel. "He's my only child. I can't imagine he'd do something like this." Laura leaned forward gently. "That's what they count on your love, making it hard to see the truth. Let's just look at the numbers and see what story they tell." Margaret handed over a folder of bank statements, and Gerald began scanning them with his tablet. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge: steady withdrawals over 18 months, each just small enough to avoid automatic bank alerts. Transfers routed through a series of accounts before landing in one registered to a business Margaret had never heard of. "Your son's name is on this business account," Gerald said quietly. Margaret stared at the page, her lips trembling. "He said it was for a project, something to help with my medical bills if I ever got sick." The lie sat heavy between us. I'd heard versions of it before, but it never got easier to watch someone's heart break in real time. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice low, "but this wasn't for you, it was for him." She didn't cry, she just nodded slowly, as though a part of her had already known and was now too tired to fight the truth. We spent the rest of the afternoon setting up safeguards on her accounts and contacting an attorney we trusted. Margaret thanked us quietly as we left, pressing a tin of homemade cookies into my hands, like it was the only way she knew to express gratitude without falling apart. Driving back to the office, Laura broke the silence. "Every time we do this, I think about Rachel, how easy it is to justify what you're taking when you've convinced yourself you deserve it." I kept my eyes on the road. Rachel never had to convince herself. She knew exactly what she was doing. She just didn't care who it hurt. Gerald glanced up from his laptop in the back seat. "Speaking of Rachel, there's something you should know." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What now?" She's been trying to contact you, letters from prison, emails through her lawyer, even a request for a visit. She says she has information about other cases people we could help. Laura looked at me, eyebrows raised. Are you going to hear her out? No, so, I said immediately. You're sure? Gerald asked. Positive. If she has information, she can give it to the FBI. I'm not her lifeline anymore. Back at the office, I found one of the letters on my desk. Her lawyer must have forwarded it before I'd made my decision clear. I didn't open it, just slid it into the shredder, listening to the paper disappear in a soft hum. That night, Laura stayed late going over a new case file, while Gerald worked on security protocols for elderly clients. I stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, the city lights blurring into gold and white. It struck me then how different this life was from the one I'd imagined at 62. I had no husband, no daughter in my life, no picture-perfect family gatherings, but I also had no illusions left, and that felt like freedom. Before locking up, I turned to Laura and Gerald. You know, when I exposed Rachel at that wedding, I thought I was just stopping her, but it was more than that. It was proof that we don't have to stay victims. Laura smiled faintly. You didn't just prove it to yourself, you proved it to the rest of us, too. We left the office together, the rain easing into a soft drizzle as I walked home through the quiet streets of Back Bay. I thought about how far I'd come from the woman sitting in her car by the harbor months ago, clutching a pearl necklace and wondering what to do next. Rachel was gone from my life. But in her absence, I'd built something better, something real. And for the first time in decades, I wasn't defined by who I'd raised, but by who I'd become. Spring settled over Boston with a kind of quiet confidence. The harbor lost its winter steeliness, the air softened, and people lingered in coffee shops with windows open to the breeze. At our office, the cases kept coming, some small, some complicated enough to stretch for weeks. But no matter the scale, each one carried that same flicker of vulnerability in the client's eyes. We'd all learned to recognize it instantly. One Tuesday morning, Gerald walked in, balancing 2 coffees and a manila envelope. This came for you, he said, setting the envelope on my desk. The return address wasn't a prison, but the handwriting was unmistakably Rachel's rounded letters. The sharp slant on the R. I didn't touch it. Trash. You might want to see what's inside, Gerald said, hesitating. Could be relevant to one of our open cases. I pushed it back toward him. If it's important, it'll find me another way. I'm not letting her back in. He didn't argue, just slid the envelope into his bag. That was one of the unspoken rules between us. Respect the boundaries, even if you didn't understand them. The day went on as usual until Laura's phone buzzed mid-afternoon. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening. It's Thomas. I looked up from my file. Whitmore. She nodded, answering. Hey, yeah, she's here. Then she handed me the phone. He wants to talk to you. Thomas's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Evelyn, I thought you should know I've been contacted by someone claiming to have information about another fraud ring connected to Dylan. They wanted to meet in person. Said they'd only talk if you were there. Who? I asked. Rachel. I leaned back in my chair, the irony bitter on my tongue. She's using you to get to me. Maybe, Thomas said, but if she's telling the truth, there might be other victims. People who don't have the luxury of walking away yet. For a moment, I said nothing. It was tempting to let it go, to let her rot in silence. But I'd built a business on finding the truth, and ignoring this would mean closing my eyes on purpose. That wasn't who I was anymore. Set it up, I said finally, but it happens on my terms. 2 days later, Laura and I drove to the federal detention center where Rachel was being held. The visiting room was a sterile, fluorescent space with rows of plastic chairs and small tables. When she walked in, wearing the standard beige jumpsuit, I was struck by how much smaller she seemed, not physically, But in presence, the defiance I'd seen at the wedding was still there, but it flickered now, edged with something like weariness. "Mom," she said as she sat down. "Evelyn," I corrected. Her mouth tightened, but she didn't argue. "I have information about Dylan and others. You think what we did to Thomas was bad. He's still running people, using new faces, new names. I can give you details." Laura crossed her arms. "And what do you want in exchange?" Rachel's gaze flicked between us. "I want you to know I'm not the only one responsible. I didn't start this. Dylan." "Stop," I said, my voice low but sharp. "You made your choices. You stayed in it. You enjoyed it. That's yours, guys, to carry." For the first time, her confidence faltered. "I can help people if you'll work with me. Just think about it." I stood. "We'll take what you have, but you won't see me again." We left with a folder of names, accounts, and dates enough to crack open 3 separate investigations. Gerald dug in that same night, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he cross-referenced every scrap of data. By the end of the week, we'd tracked one of Dylan's new operatives to Chicago, another to Miami, both in the middle of exploiting men they'd been with for over a year. We passed everything to the FBI, and within days, arrests were made. The news barely mentioned Rachel's role, focusing instead on Dylan's network and the scope of the fraud. That was fine with me. She'd get no redemption in the headlines. One evening, after the Chicago case wrapped, Laura and I stayed late at the office, sorting through client files. She poured 2 glasses of wine and slid one across the desk. "You know," she said, "you could have ignored her, let the FBI find those cases eventually." I could have, I agreed. But the people in those files, they didn't have time for eventually. Laura studied me for a long moment. "You're not the same woman I met in that coffee shop." "I hope not." Outside, the city lights reflected on the harbor, sharp and clear. I thought about the path from that night at the rehearsal dinner to this moment, how every step away from Rachel had been a step towards something truer. We closed up the office just after midnight. The air was cool, the streets quiet. I walked home alone, the sound of my heels tapping against the pavement steady, certain. I didn't think about Rachel again that night. I thought about Margaret Collins in Cambridge, the Chicago victims, the Miami arrests, and I thought about the woman I'd finally become, the one who no longer mistook endurance for love, or silence for peace. The work wasn't over. It probably never would be. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into the fight weighed down by someone else's lies. I was walking in with my own truth, and that was more than enough. When I look back now, the most surprising part isn't how far Rachel fell, it's how far I climbed once I let go of her. I stopped trying to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed and started building a life that couldn't be torn apart by lies. Every case we take now, every victim we help, feels like another brick laid in the wall between who I was and who I've become. I used to think family was something you were bound to no matter what. Now I know family is the people you choose, the ones who show up, who fight for you, who tell you the truth, even when it hurts. I've found that family in Laura, in Gerald, and in the clients who trust us with their stories. If you've ever been betrayed, know this: you can survive it, you can come back stronger, and you can write your own ending. I did, and so can you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it struck a chord with you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to walk away from what breaks you. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what's the moment that made you take back your own power